Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It began with the first letter. It was not an ordinary envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just a blank piece of paper inside and a single line written in neat, precise handwriting, "They are waiting for you." I stared at those words for what felt like hours. My fingers trembled, but I couldn't stop looking at the letter. I had never seen this handwriting before, and yet something about it felt familiar. I tried to brush it off as a prank, but as I walked back to my desk, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced around my apartment, a small one-bedroom place in the corner of the city. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed to be holding something, like they were waiting too. But waiting for what? I had been living alone for years, ever since, well, it didn't matter. I had long learned to avoid certain memories. Life was easier that way. Easier than dealing with the past. But this letter, it had opened a door I thought I had closed. I crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash, but that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, spinning in circles. What did it mean? Who could have sent it? And why now? The next day, I woke up late for work, groggy and disoriented, but the moment I stepped into the kitchen, another letter lay on the table. My heart skipped a beat. This time, the words were different. Do you remember what happened? It was too much. Too soon. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest, but I knew I couldn't. I hadn't asked for this. I didn't want to know. But the letters, each one more cryptic than the last, kept coming. The third letter arrived that afternoon. You can't escape them. I shuddered as I opened it, the envelope feeling heavier than it should. Inside, there was a small photo. It was of a house, an old, crumbling place. I didn't recognize it at first, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It reminded me of a place I had seen long ago. The familiar feeling stirred again, deep inside me. A sense of dread, of something I had long buried, trying to claw its way to the surface. That night, as I sat in my dimly lit apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the house in the photo. Why did it seem so familiar? What was I missing? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow moving in the corner of my vision. But nothing. Just the quiet hum of the city outside. I put the letter down, but the unease lingered, like a presence in the room. The next morning, as I prepared for work, I noticed something strange, something I hadn't seen the night before. There was a shadow in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but no. There it was, stretching unnaturally long across the floor, as if it was reaching out toward me. I froze. And then, I heard it. A faint, scratching sound from the walls, like fingernails dragging along the surface. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I could feel it, the same sensation I had experienced when I was younger, that sense of being watched, of being trapped. I rushed to the door, but the moment I touched the handle, it stopped. The noise, the shadow, everything. And that's when I knew. The letters were just the beginning. Something was after me, and it wasn't going to stop until I found the truth. The truth about the house, the truth about my past. But was I ready to face it? The answers were out there, somewhere, waiting for me to unravel them. But I had no idea just how deep the darkness went. The next few days passed in a blur. The letters kept coming, each one more cryptic than the last. But it wasn't just the letters that were bothering me. It was the feeling, the sense of being followed, watched. Like every step I took was anticipated by something I couldn't see. At night, when I closed my eyes, the scratching from the walls would return. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but growing louder as the darkness deepened. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it, the presence, just beyond the edge of my perception. The air around me felt thicker, almost suffocating, like something ancient was slowly waking up. The house in the photograph was always on my mind. I had to know more about it. There had to be a reason why it felt so familiar. I didn't remember it from my own past, at least, not consciously, but my gut told me it was important. The next evening, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running from the truth. I needed to find that house. I pulled out the photograph again, studying it closely. The building looked abandoned, old and weathered by years of neglect. There was something off about it, like it wasn't quite right. The trees around it were bent at odd angles, as though they had been twisted by something unnatural. I began searching online. It didn't take long to find it. The house was real, and it wasn't too far away from where I lived. In fact, it was only about an hour's drive, tucked away in the outskirts of the city, hidden from the main roads. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked at the map. It didn't make sense. I had never seen the house before, at least not in this life. But somehow, I knew I had to go. I didn't want to, but I couldn't ignore the pull anymore. I left my apartment early the next morning, the sun barely rising as I made my way out of the city. The drive was quiet, too quiet. The radio refused to pick up any signals, and my thoughts seemed louder than ever, echoing in the stillness. As I approached the area where the house should be, I noticed the landscape changing. The trees grew thicker, their branches stretching out like fingers, reaching toward me. The road was rough, barely maintained, and the deeper I drove, the more unsettling it became. The air felt heavier, colder, like the world around me was holding its breath. Finally, I saw it. The house stood at the edge of a small clearing, hidden from the main road by a thicket of trees. It was even more imposing up close, decayed, crumbling, and overgrown with vines. The windows were dark, almost like eyes staring back at me, hollow and unblinking. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and hesitated. A cold breeze swept through the trees, and I heard the sound of something rustling in the distance. It was too quiet, too still. I walked toward the house, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path, each one echoing in the silence. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a wave of stale air hit me. The smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming, but there was something else beneath it, a faint scent of something burnt, like an old fire that had never quite gone out. Inside, the house was dark. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I could hear the faint whispering of the wind outside, but nothing else. No voices. No footsteps. I made my way through the hall, each room more dilapidated than the last. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and the furniture, though old and covered in sheets, looked strangely untouched. It was like time had stopped here, but it wasn't a peaceful stillness. It felt as though something had been left behind, something waiting for me. As I walked deeper into the house, I heard it again. That scratching sound. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It was coming from upstairs. I froze. My heart began to race, but blood pounding in my ears. The letters. The house. The scratching. It was all connected. I couldn't stop myself. I had to go up there. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step a hesitant creak beneath me. The air grew colder the higher I went, and by the time I reached the second floor, I could feel a heavy pressure building in my chest. The scratching was louder now, like something was trying to claw its way out from behind the walls. I reached the top of the stairs and looked around. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the weak light filtering in from the cracked windows. The walls were lined with old photographs, their faces faded and indistinct. I couldn't make out any details, but something about them felt wrong. Almost as if the people in the photos were watching me, silently judging me. I walked past the rooms, my breath shallow. The scratching was unbearable now. It seemed to be coming from the end of the hall, from behind a door that stood ajar, barely visible in the dim light. I hesitated. What was behind that door? I knew, deep down, that I couldn't turn back now. I had come this far, and whatever waited for me in that room was the key to everything. With a shaking hand, I pushed the door open. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a room that seemed to be trapped in time. Dust lay thick on the floor, and the air was stale, carrying the scent of something long forgotten. The walls were bare except for a single, cracked mirror, its surface reflecting a distorted version of the room. The room felt oddly familiar, yet completely foreign, as though I had been here before but could not place when. The scratching noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed down on me, suffocating and heavy, and for a moment I stood frozen, unsure if I had imagined the sound or if something truly was waiting just beyond my perception. I glanced around, my heart racing, but nothing seemed to move. Everything appeared still, almost too still. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I moved slowly toward the far corner of the room. The mirror caught my attention first. It was odd, like something was off about the way it reflected the space around it. It almost seemed as though the room in the reflection was not the same as the one I was standing in. The edges of the image flickered, distorting like water ripples, but only for a moment. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. A cold gust of air swirled around me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned, instinctively reaching for something, anything, to steady myself. And then I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the farthest corner of the room, just outside the reflection of the mirror. It was impossible to make out any clear details at first, just a silhouette, shrouded in shadow, its presence so overwhelming it seemed to drain the life from the space around it. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. I stumbled back, my breath shallow and quick. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined it? There was no sound, no movement, just that unnerving stillness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The letters, the photographs, the strange pull to this house, it was all connected, and I was getting closer to something I was not sure I was ready to uncover. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what this was, what the meaning of all of this was. As I crossed the room, I noticed something else. Beneath the dust and debris, there was a faint outline on the floor, a shape that looked too deliberate to be random. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dirt and found a trapdoor. It was small and unassuming, like it had been hidden for years. There was no obvious way to open it, but as I ran my fingers along the edges, I felt something shift beneath my touch. A faint click echoed through the room, and the trapdoor slowly creaked open. My pulse quickened. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, and for a moment, I almost pulled away, my mind screaming at me to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't. I had come this far. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open fully. Below, a narrow staircase descended into the darkness. I couldn't see what lay below, but I could hear something. The faintest sound of movement, something or someone scraping against the walls in the depths of the darkness. It wasn't a wind or a shift in the house. This was something else. Something alive. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. Slowly, carefully, I descended. Each step was a battle against my own terror, each creak of the old wood beneath me amplifying the sound of my heartbeat. The temperature dropped even further the deeper I went, and my breath began to fog in front of me, the cold biting into my skin. Finally, I reached the bottom. The air down here was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel a heaviness in the atmosphere, like the room itself was pressing in on me. I could barely make out the shapes of old furniture covered in sheets, their outlines blurred by the dim light filtering in from the faint cracks in the walls. In the center of the room stood something that froze me in my tracks. A pedestal, bathed in an eerie light, as if something inside the room was casting it from beyond my reach. On the pedestal lay an object, small, delicate, and yet impossibly heavy with meaning. It was a book. But not just any book. It was the same book that had appeared in the photographs, the same book that had been mentioned in the letters. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed with age, but it was unmistakable. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. The instant my fingers made contact with the cover, a sharp pain shot through my body. It wasn't physical, it was as though something was reaching out from within the book, gripping my mind and forcing its way inside. The world around me blurred, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. Memories flooded my consciousness, fragments of a life I couldn't place, faces I didn't recognize, and places I had never seen. I gasped for breath, trying to pull away from the overwhelming flood of images, but it was too much. I was drowning in it. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw her. A woman, standing in front of me, her face pale and hollow. Her eyes were dark, endless voids, and her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. But the message was clear, her gaze pierced through me, and for the first time, I understood. The ghost. The ghost of unresolved secrets. She was calling me, and I had no choice but to follow. The room shifted again, or perhaps it was my mind that had shifted. Everything felt warped, as though the boundaries of reality had begun to collapse. My body was still on the staircase, trembling, my fingers still grazing the edges of the cursed book. But in my mind, I was somewhere else. The woman, she was closer now. I could feel her presence, her gaze pressing against me. The air grew heavier with each passing second, and I felt as though I was suffocating beneath the weight of her stare. Her eyes, endless black pits, seemed to pierce through the very core of my being. I tried to pull away, to break free from whatever hold she had over me, but my body refused to obey. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. Only the cold, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, the image of her haunting my mind. Time seemed to stretch, becoming elastic, and my thoughts became jumbled, twisting and warping in ways that made no sense. There were voices, Whispers, soft but insistent, crawling from the shadows, telling me things I couldn't quite grasp. And then, without warning, the woman moved. She didn't walk. She glided, sliding across the floor as though her feet never touched the ground. Her hair, black as coal, seemed to flow around her, and her skin, so pale it almost glowed in the darkness, rippled like the surface of a still pond disturbed by a single drop of water. I felt the urge to run, to escape, but my body remained paralyzed, rooted to the spot. My eyes followed her every movement, unable to look away. She came closer, and as she did, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so sharply that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The whispers in my ears became louder, more urgent, and I could feel them burrowing into my mind, filling me with a growing sense of dread. The weight of her presence was unbearable. Then, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost a murmur, and yet it reverberated in my skull like a distant thunderclap. You shouldn't have opened it. Her words made my blood run cold. I wanted to speak, to protest, to explain that I had no choice, that I was trying to understand, but no words came out. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted. She continued, her form flickering like a dying flame. You've awakened something that should have remained buried. The price of knowledge is steep, and now you will pay. As she spoke, I felt something change inside me. It was as if the very essence of who I was, the foundation of my being, was being unraveled. My thoughts became more fragmented, harder to hold on to. Memories, unbidden, started to flood in, memories of a life that wasn't mine, memories of places I had never been, faces I had never seen. And then, like a veil lifting, I saw it. The truth, the terrible, terrible truth. The woman was not a stranger to me. She was someone from my past, someone I had forgotten, buried deep within the recesses of my mind. Her name. I couldn't remember it, but I knew her face, just a flash, a fragment of an image, and then it was gone again. A rush of terror washed over me. What was happening? Why was she haunting me now? What did it all mean? But before I could process any more, a sharp, searing pain shot through my chest, as though someone, was pulling at my very soul. I gasped, unable to breathe, my body shuddering in agony. The woman's image flickered, her mouth stretching into a grotesque smile. The whispers grew louder, maddening, until they felt like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. I blinked and found myself standing in the center of the room, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me. The woman was gone. The book, still sitting on the pedestal, looked unchanged, untouched by the horrors I had just witnessed. But I knew better. I knew the truth now. Whatever I had awakened, whatever was watching me, it wasn't going to stop. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep my grip on reality. The room had become something else, unfamiliar and alien. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the air growing thick and oppressive. I could hear faint whispers now, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, their words a blur of fear and desperation. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me, suffocating me with its gravity. There was no escape. Not anymore. I turned, desperate to find a way out, but the door I had come through had vanished. The room was no longer a room, it was a maze, twisting and shifting with every step I took. I didn't know what was real anymore, what was a product of my imagination, or what was truly happening. But one thing was clear, the past had returned, and with it, the ghosts I had tried to forget. And now, they weren't going to let me go. I could feel it in the air, a presence watching, waiting. And I knew, with cold certainty, that whatever this was, whatever I had unleashed, I was its next victim. But the question that kept echoing in my mind was the one I could never answer. Had it all been real? Or had I simply lost my mind? I stood there, disoriented, trying to gather my senses. My hands trembled uncontrollably, my mind a tangled mess of confusion. The walls of the room, which had once felt like a familiar cage, now seemed to shift around me, stretching, warping, pulling apart like the very fabric of reality was being torn at the seams. My breath quickened as I fought to regain control over my mind, over my body. But there was no control. The terror was relentless, flooding every thought with impossible images, impossible fears. I could feel the woman's presence again, even though she wasn't there. That same oppressive force, like an unseen weight pressing down on me, was suffocating me, choking the very air from my lungs. Her words echoed in my mind, looping over and over again like a broken record. The price of knowledge is steep, and now you will pay. What had I done? The questions raced through my head, but none of them could find an answer. I wanted to believe it was all just some nightmare, some twisted vision of my shattered psyche. But the room, the space around me, was changing. I could see it, feel it. The edges of the world were blurring, becoming less solid, more transient. As if I were slipping between dimensions, caught in a net of fractured realities. I stumbled forward, my legs weak beneath me, trying to make sense of anything, but the further I moved, the worse it got. Each step felt like a descent into something darker, deeper. The whispers grew louder, louder until they drowned out every other sound. I tried to cover my ears, but it didn't help. They were inside me, inside my mind, clawing at my thoughts. Get out. Leave before it's too late. It's too late. The whispers weren't just voices anymore. They had become something else. Something living, something that reached inside me, twisting my thoughts into knots. I felt the fear tighten around my chest like a vice, every breath more labored than the last. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And yet I had to move. I had to escape. In the distance, I saw the door, standing ajar, a faint, flickering light spilling through the gap. Hope flared in my chest, a false promise of safety. I didn't know where the door led, but I had to try. I had to get away from the voices. Away from her. But as I neared the door, someone stepped into my path. It was the woman again. Her figure appeared like a wisp of smoke, almost formless, flickering in and out of existence, her face never fully visible, yet I could feel her eyes boring into me. The closer I got, the more her form solidified until she was standing before me, her long, dark hair swirling around her like the wind was alive, pulling at her, caressing her. She raised her hand, and I froze. Her voice, low, hollow, a whisper that felt like it came from the depths of the earth, cut through the chaos in my mind. Running will not save you. I tried to back away, my pulse racing. But the floor beneath me seemed to melt, pulling me down, dragging me into the shadows, deeper and deeper. Her voice, that whisper, now wrapped itself around me like chains, binding me to her, to this place. And then, just like before, the pain came. A sharp, burning sensation coursed through me, not from outside, but from within. My chest felt as if it were being torn open, as though my soul itself were being ripped apart, shredded by some invisible force. I gasped, falling to my knees, clutching at my chest as if I could hold myself together. I was slipping. I could feel myself losing myself, being consumed. I didn't understand how, why this was happening. The pain, the torment, was too much. My mind was fracturing, my sense of self disintegrating like dust in the wind. And then, another voice joined the chorus. This one different. It was a man's voice, distant but clear, cutting through the suffocating fog. He was calling my name, urgently, as if trying to reach me through the chaos. Jonathan! Wake up! I blinked, confusion clouding my mind. Jonathan? That wasn't my name. But the voice, the urgency in it, it felt familiar, somehow. Almost like someone who knew me. And then I realized something was wrong. The room was wrong. The darkness was wrong. It was all wrong. The air shifted again, swirling around me like a vortex. The walls bent, and the floor buckled beneath my feet. The door, it was gone. Vanished, replaced by more shadows, endless shadows that stretched out before me. The woman, her presence still hung in the air, but I could feel something else now. Something more ancient, more powerful. The whispers had stopped, and in their place was something far more dangerous, silence. The silence was deafening. It was absolute. It was terrifying. A feeling, like a cold wind rushing through me, filled my body. It was the sensation of being watched, of being prey. The fear that had plagued me before now surged in full force, tightening my chest, pulling me toward the ground. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And in that moment, a terrible realization settled over me. I wasn't in control. Not anymore. The truth was clear now, as clear as the suffocating silence that surrounded me. I had opened the door. No, I had torn it open, and now there was no going back. The past, the ghosts, the horrors, they had followed me here. They had always been here, lurking just beneath the surface. But now, they were not just in my mind. They were real. And they were coming for me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. And then, just as it all seemed to collapse in on me, I saw something. A flicker in the dark. A figure. Standing just beyond the edge of my vision. And then, with one last breath, I realized who it was. And everything went black. It was one of those evenings where the silence felt heavy. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and fills the room with something you can't quite place. I sat alone in my apartment, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The city outside was muted, its usual hum softened by the fog. The clock ticked, but even that sound seemed strange, distant. I wasn't thinking about much, just letting my mind wander. But then, it happened. A noise. Barely noticeable at first. Just a small rustle, like paper being shifted. I told myself it was nothing. Probably the wind. The window was cracked open, letting in a cool draft. But then it happened again, this time, clearer. It wasn't the wind. I glanced over my shoulder, but the apartment was empty, just the familiar, quiet space I had lived in for months. Nothing seemed out of place, yet something felt wrong. My skin prickled as if someone was watching me. But I shook it off. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but the words blurred. The room seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. my thoughts kept circling back to that noise. That rustle. Was it something behind me? I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The shadows moved, stretching long across the floor, but nothing unusual. Still, my heart raced a little faster. I had always been sensitive to small sounds, perhaps too sensitive. Then, there it was again, clear this time, like a whisper. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be the old pipes, the creak of the floorboards. Or maybe I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again. Louder. The unmistakable sound of my name. Mark. I stood up quickly, my pulse quickening. I thought I was hearing things, my mind playing tricks on me. But this felt real. Like it came from somewhere right behind me. Mark. I spun around, my breath shallow. There was no one there. The room was still. Too still. I took a slow step toward the corner, my eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening. My reflection stared back at me from the window. The figure in the glass didn't look like me. At least not exactly. The face seemed off, too pale, too still, like it wasn't my own. I blinked and the image was gone. I felt the chill creep deeper into my bones. Something was wrong. The silence around me was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. Was it the isolation? Had I just been alone too long? Or was something else watching me? The thought lingered, and I couldn't shake it. I reached for my phone, but it slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. As I bent down to pick it up, the shadows around me seemed to shift. I paused, heart racing, as the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. But the apartment was still. Empty. I pressed my ear to the door, but I could hear nothing. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside the apartment. The apartment I was sure I was alone in. I stood there, frozen, pressed against the door, my heart thundering in my chest. The footsteps grew louder. They weren't like the sound of someone walking in the hallway outside. No, they were inside. Moving slowly, deliberately, as if testing the silence of the apartment, waiting for me to react. I took a step back, my feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor. I couldn't think straight. I needed to leave. But where would I go? The apartment building was empty, everyone else either away or asleep, and I was alone. The footsteps continued. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just the neighbors? But no, the timing was off. The sound didn't match anything I knew. It wasn't random like someone just walking. It was paced, calculated. It knew I was here. I looked around the room, but nothing had changed. The shadows were deeper now, the corners of the room swallowed in darkness. My eyes lingered on the window, but it was too dark outside to see anything. Just the outline of buildings and the fog rolling in. The chill of the air from the open window gnawed at my skin, but it wasn't enough to calm the creeping dread that had settled deep in my bones. Mark. The whisper echoed again, this time softer, almost like a breath. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the dark corners of the room or from somewhere inside my own mind. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I had to be imagining it. But what if I wasn't? I took a few steps back, away from the door, my body moving against its own will, like some invisible force was pushing me backward. The floor creaked under my weight, the sound too loud in the suffocating silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then they went out completely. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat as I fumbled for the light switch. My fingers brushed against the wall, but the switch was gone. I cursed under my breath, swiping at the darkness around me. My mind raced to find a reason, some logical explanation. Maybe a fuse had blown? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. Then came the sound again, this time from right behind me. The slow, deliberate footfalls. So close that I could almost feel the breath of whoever, or whatever, was moving closer. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space of the room, swallowing every ounce of light and reason. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I could taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. My body trembled, but I couldn't make myself move. The footsteps didn't stop, though. They kept coming, drawing nearer. And then, a shadow moved across the floor. It wasn't just a trick of the light. This was real. This thing was real. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. My eyes darted toward the corner of the room where the shadow had shifted. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then I saw it again. A figure, barely discernible in the dark, tall and thin, stretching unnaturally long. My breath hitched. I tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. The figure wasn't moving like a person. It was wrong. Its limbs were elongated, jerking at odd angles, as though it couldn't quite figure out how to walk. It wasn't quite human, and yet it was. The shape of a person, but twisted, with a face that didn't belong in the world. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body was locked in place, frozen in fear. The figure tilted its head to one side, the movement smooth, too smooth. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, clearer, cold. Mark. The sound of my name sent a shock through my spine, making every hair on my body stand on end. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry, my voice lost somewhere deep inside me. The figure took a step forward, and the room seemed to warp around it as if reality itself was bending. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. The figure moved closer, its steps eerily soundless. I could hear nothing but my ragged breath and the low hum of terror building in my chest. The closer it got, the more I could feel it. The pressure. The cold that sank deep into my bones. It was standing over me now. I could feel its presence, suffocating. I dared not look up, but the weight of its gaze was unmistakable. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Then, without warning, the figure reached down, and the cold touch of its hand grazed my shoulder. I screamed. The sound echoed in my mind, louder than anything else. I shot to my feet and ran, not looking back. My mind screamed at me to escape, but my body was acting on pure instinct, driven by pure fear. I barreled toward the door, throwing it open, and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. But when I looked behind me, there was nothing. No figure. No shadow. Just silence. I backed away, the panic still gripping me, unsure if I had imagined it all. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos, but the fear didn't leave. Something had been there. and it was still watching me. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed by the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. I backed away from the door, my feet stumbling on the uneven floor, my mind trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. But the more I tried to understand, the more I felt like I was slipping away from reality. Was I losing my mind? No. This wasn't just in my head. Someone was here. It had to be real. The figure, the voice, they were too vivid, too clear to be imagined. I stood there, my back pressed against the hallway wall, my eyes darting down the corridor, searching for any sign of movement. The building was eerily quiet, but that only made the tension worse. The silence was thick now, like the whole place had swallowed every sound. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite grasp. The air was different. It felt wrong, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My breath came out in a sharp, visible puff, and I rubbed my arms, trying to chase away the cold that had seeped into my skin. I glanced back toward the door to my apartment, the one I had just fled. It looked normal, too normal. No shadows, no signs of anything amiss. But I knew better now. I had seen it. Felt it. The thing was real. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. Every inch of me screamed to run, but I had to confront it. I needed to understand what was happening. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent. The flickering overhead light above me seemed to cast long, unnatural shadows, their edges curling like tendrils, reaching toward me. I approached the door cautiously, listening to the faintest creaks under my feet. With a trembling hand, I reached for the handle. The door swung open without resistance. But as I stepped back inside, I immediately felt it. That presence. The same cold that had clung to my skin earlier, the same oppressive feeling that weighed down on me. The apartment looked the same worn furniture, same crooked paintings on the walls. But it felt different. It felt wrong. I moved through the space, my eyes scanning every corner, every inch of the room. I half expected the shadow to jump out at me, to grab me by the throat, to drag me back into the darkness. But there was nothing. The apartment remained still, almost unnervingly so. I thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had just been too isolated, too alone for too long. I took a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself. The quiet was suffocating, and I needed something to break it. That's when I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. It wasn't my name this time. It was something else. Something deeper. A word, maybe? I couldn't make it out, but it echoed in the room, filling the space with a strange resonance. I froze. It was coming from the corner. The same corner where I had seen the shadow move. I walked toward it, my feet barely making a sound, heart hammering in my chest. The whispers grew louder as I neared, but they were still too quiet to understand. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beside the window, the shadows seemed to bend and twist, like they were alive. The darkness was pooling there, moving in on itself, swirling in patterns that made no sense. It was like something was reaching out from the darkness, testing the air, trying to find a way to break free. My breath caught in my throat. The air felt thick again, stifling. My legs shook beneath me, but I couldn't move away. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the corner. The whispers were growing louder now, but they didn't sound like any language I knew. They were distorted, garbled, like voices from far away, from another world. They echoed inside my skull, reverberating through my thoughts, wrapping around my mind, suffocating me. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what it was, but nothing came out. The silence inside my head was deafening, and the whispers consumed it. Suddenly, I felt something shift in the room, a cold rush of air, like something had just materialized in front of me. I turned sharply, but again, I saw nothing. My heart pounded in my chest. I was sure I had seen something, just a flicker, a shift in the air, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. I stood there, paralyzed, my gaze shifting nervously across the room. The apartment felt too small now, like the walls were closing in on me, pushing me toward the center. The shadows were no longer just still. They moved with me, stretching, twisting. Then came the noise again. A loud, unmistakable bang. It came from the bathroom. I jumped back, my body reacting before my mind could process. I had to check. I had to know what it was. I took a hesitant step toward the bathroom, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, the more oppressive the silence. And then another noise. A soft scrape, like something was dragging across the floor. I pushed open the bathroom door, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The mirror was shattered. Shards of glass were scattered across the floor. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. It was the message. Etched into the mirror, running along the cracked surface, was a single word: leave. My mind spun. How had it appeared? Was I going crazy? I had to be. But I knew it wasn't possible to have done it myself. The mirror had been fine just hours ago. There was no way it had shattered like that on its own. I stepped back, feeling the panic rise again. The figure, the whispering, the feeling of being watched, it was all real. But why? Why me? And then the whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the empty apartment. Leave, Mark. It was almost a command now. I staggered backward, the sense of dread crawling under my skin. Something wanted me gone. Something didn't want me here. And it wasn't just in my mind anymore. The echo was alive. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room had thickened, pressing against my chest, squeezing the life out of me. My heart raced, pounding painfully in my ears, drowning out the whispers. Leave, Mark. It echoed in my mind, relentless, like a drumbeat in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. I backed away from the bathroom, my legs shaky, my mind too consumed with fear to think clearly. I didn't know what was real anymore. The mirror, the message, it was all too much. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even want to. I just wanted to leave. But the apartment felt like a trap. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows closing in, tightening their grip on me. I turned toward the door, but before I could move, something stopped me. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not in the hallway this time. No, these were closer. Right behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but the room was empty, just the usual clutter of furniture, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the dim light of the street lamps filtering through the window. But I knew better. I knew it was still here, whatever it was. The footsteps came again, more distinct this time. I froze, my back pressed against the wall. They weren't just steps. They were deliberate. Slow. and they were moving toward me, toward the corner where the shadows had been shifting earlier. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and stepping into the hallway, but as I did, the air hit me like a wave, a sudden, suffocating pressure. It felt like the apartment was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I didn't even look back. I couldn't. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. My breath came in ragged gasps, panic clouding my every thought. The building felt alive. The walls were too close, the floors too hard underfoot. There was no escape. I reached the stairs and began to ascend, my body moving on instinct. My mind screamed at me to stop, to think, to breathe, but I couldn't. I had to get out. I had to get away. At the top of the stairs, I paused, my pulse hammering in my throat. Something was wrong. The air was heavier here, the quiet more oppressive. The building felt empty, but not in the way I was used to. It was an unnatural emptiness. The kind of silence that doesn't just feel quiet, it feels empty, as if something essential has been removed. I stood frozen, listening, but hearing only the sound of my own breath and the pounding in my chest. Then the whisper came again. This time it was clear. So clear that it pierced my skull. "Mark," it said, a voice that was both familiar and alien, like it was coming from inside my head, but also from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. "You can't leave. Not yet." I felt the temperature drop. A sharp, biting cold that cut through my clothes, sinking into my skin. I shuddered, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me. My teeth chattered involuntarily. I stepped backward, but my foot caught on something. I glanced down, but there was nothing there. No object. Just the floor, stretching endlessly beneath me. A crack in the wood caught my eye, jagged and wide, like a gaping wound in the building itself. And then it happened. The door at the far end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jerked, spinning around to face it. The door to the apartment, the one I had just fled, was now closed. But it wasn't the same. The shadows around it were wrong. Twisting, shifting, like something was moving beneath the surface. The light flickered and dimmed, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, reaching for me with unseen hands. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I was frozen in place. From the darkness beyond the door, I could hear it. The sound of someone, or something, breathing. Heavy, labored breaths, low and guttural, as if it was trying to speak through the walls. The sound echoed in the hallway, filling the space around me, and the whisper grew louder. "Mark." I turned, desperately searching for a way out. The stairs behind me were now just a blur of darkness, their familiar shape lost in the overwhelming shadow that seemed to swallow everything. The hallway stretched out before me like an endless tunnel, and every door on either side was closed, silent. I turned back toward the door to my apartment. It was the only option, the only place I could think of that might give me answers. The only place that might hold the truth of what was happening. I made my way toward it, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. But as soon as my fingers touched the cold metal, the door jerked open violently, as if something on the other side was trying to stop me from entering. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I had no choice. I stepped through the door and into the apartment. The room was darker than before. The shadows seemed deeper, more sinister, as if they were watching me, waiting. The air was thick with a strange, almost metallic scent like rust and decay. I took one step, then another, but before I could make it to the center of the room, I froze. Something was moving in the corner again. I didn't need to look to know what it was. I could feel it, like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me. I could feel it, closing in, hunting me. I turned, but as I did, the shadow was gone. Only, it wasn't gone. It was there. Right behind me. I spun around again, but now I saw it. The shape. The figure. The one that had been following me all along. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real. Its form stretched and shifted, like something trying to take on a human shape but failing, its limbs too long, too thin, contorted in ways that made my stomach turn. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the room seemed to collapse around me. The walls seemed to bend and twist, the floor shifting under my feet. I tried to take a step back, but the air was too thick, too heavy. The figure reached out a hand. It was long, too long. And as it touched my shoulder, I felt its cold grip, the ice-cold fingers digging into my skin. "Leave, Mark," it whispered, its voice now more than just a whisper. It was a command. An order. A force. And in that moment, I knew. There was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. I couldn't move. The cold fingers on my shoulders seemed to seep into my very bones, draining me of all warmth. My body felt like it was made of stone, heavy and unyielding. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. The air was thick, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The figure loomed over me, its twisted form barely human, its face obscured in the shadows. It stood still, its presence suffocating, as if it existed in the very fabric of the room itself, woven into the walls, the air, the darkness. The whispering, those incessant, guttural voices, swirled around me, louder now, filling my ears with their demands, their endless beckoning. "Leave," it rasped again, its voice a mix of both sorrow and malice. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I wanted to argue, to scream that I couldn't leave, that I was already lost, but the words caught in my throat. What was the point? Was I even in control of my own actions anymore? I glanced around frantically. The apartment seemed even more distorted now, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. The walls twisted, the furniture blurred and shifted. The light, once warm, comforting, was now a sickly, unnatural hue, casting shadows that flickered and danced like they were alive. The figure behind me moved again, its elongated limbs creaking like old wood. The movement was so unnatural, so wrong, that it made my stomach turn. It leaned closer, its breath cold against my ear. "Leave," it repeated. "You cannot stay." But I wasn't sure if it was speaking to me anymore. Was it talking to itself? To whatever it was that had been calling me? The voice seemed to be getting deeper, more insistent, more fragmented. The longer I stayed, the more it consumed me, drowning out everything else. I thought I had reached my limit, but then the room shifted again. The apartment collapsed around me. Or at least, that's what it felt like. The walls folded inward, and the floor beneath me seemed to ripple like water. I stumbled, my legs giving out, but before I hit the ground, the figure caught me, its cold hands steadying me. "You must leave," it whispered, but the voice was no longer just an echo. It was mine. It was as if the figure had stolen it and merged with my own thoughts, pulling at my very identity, unraveling who I was. My heart hammered in my chest. The room felt like it was spinning, or rather, it felt as though I was spinning. The ground wasn't solid anymore. The walls were no longer fixed. There was no stability, no certainty. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. But when I opened them again, I wasn't in the apartment anymore. The world around me had changed completely. I was standing in the middle of a vast, empty void. No walls. No ceiling. No floor. Just an endless sea of blackness. And in the distance, I could see a faint, flickering light, almost like a star, but too bright, too close. It seemed to pull at me, drawing me in. The figure wasn't with me anymore, but I could feel its presence, like a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, always there, watching. I didn't know if this was real anymore. I didn't know what was happening. Was this a dream? Was this the end? My mind screamed for answers, but all I could do was walk toward that light, that unrelenting pull that seemed to be guiding me. With each step I took, the darkness pressed closer. The air was thick with static, buzzing like 100 voices whispering just beyond my reach. I could hear them now, thousands of voices, all speaking at once. Some were soft, like whispers, others were harsh and demanding. Some were familiar, their words twisted and distant, as if they were calling my name. But as I continued walking, the whispers started to quiet, fading into the background. The light grew brighter, and with it, the sense of dread lifted. I thought maybe I had made it. Maybe I had escaped. Maybe this was the end of it. But then, something else emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the figure. It wasn't a physical being at all. It was something worse. A face. No, not just a face, my face. But it wasn't me. It was wrong. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and the smile that stretched across its lips was a grotesque mockery. It was a mirror image of me, but it wasn't mine. It couldn't be. Its features were distorted, twisted into something dark, something monstrous. I stopped dead in my tracks. Who are you? I asked, but the words were barely audible, swallowed by the overwhelming silence of the void. The figure, my reflection, tilted its head, its smile widening impossibly, stretching further and further, until it seemed to split the darkness itself. You know who I am, it said, its voice not just a whisper but a roar. It was the voice of the thing that had been haunting me all along, the thing that had been chasing me, pulling at my soul. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't a thing at all. It was a part of me. I had been running from myself. From the parts of me I couldn't face, from the fears I had buried deep inside. The figure, the whispers, the shadows, it was all a reflection of my own guilt, my own self-loathing, my own mind tearing itself apart. The walls of reality shattered, and I fell. I fell into the endless void, into the darkness where everything became a blur, where nothing was real and everything was a lie. And then there was silence. I don't know how long I was there, lost in the nothingness, trapped in my own mind. But eventually, I woke. I woke to the sound of my own breath, ragged and shallow, my body trembling as though I had been through some unimaginable ordeal. I was back in my apartment. Everything was as it had been before, too familiar, too normal, but it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. The door was ajar. The shadows in the corners were still there, but they didn't move. The air didn't feel as heavy. I walked over to the door, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me, as if the storm had passed. But as I stepped outside, the world wasn't quite as I remembered it. The air was colder. The streets emptier. The silence, too silent. I stepped forward, but something caught my eye. On the ground, near the curb, lay a small, broken object. A cracked ring, its edges sharp and jagged. I reached down, and as my fingers brushed against it, a voice, my own voice, whispered in the back of my mind. Leave. It's strange, isn't it? How something so invisible, so silent, can hold so much power. I've always thought that fear came from something tangible, something you could see, touch, or even hear. But now, in this city consumed by a plague, I realize that true terror has no form. The first sign of the night came with the silence. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy, suffocating. The kind that makes you question if your ears are still working, or if they've become too numb to pick up the sounds of the world around you. The city had fallen quiet long before I'd closed my door for the night. The streets were barren, the usual hum of the world smothered by a heavy blanket of dread. I could feel it. The quiet was like a thick fog, enveloping everything, hiding it from view. Every creak of the house, every rustle of my clothes seemed magnified, too loud, too sharp. I sank into the chair by the window, looking out at the empty streets, the dim light from the street lamp flickering weakly as if it too feared the night. The air had a strange chill to it, not the kind brought by a winter storm, but a cold that felt unnatural. It gnawed at my skin, creeping in through the cracks in the walls, filling the room with something that made my breath catch in my throat. A part of me tried to reason it away. This was just the wind, maybe some draft slipping through the window. But the rational part of me wasn't quite so sure. I could hear it now, the distant scratching sound from behind the door. It was soft at first, almost like the whisper of the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something creeping, something that made my heart beat faster, louder than it should. I stood up, my body stiff, my feet slow to move. Every step I took seemed to echo through the room, too loud, too deliberate. The scratching continued, growing louder, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't the wind. There was no breeze. My mind raced, caught between disbelief and fear. It's nothing, I whispered to myself. It's nothing. Just your imagination. But my words felt hollow in the silence, like a lie I was telling myself to avoid the truth. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than I remembered. The scratching sound stopped, and the silence came back, even thicker than before. I stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. And then, a low, rasping breath. I froze, my chest tightening as the breath seemed to come from the other side of the door. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world seemed to narrow down to that one moment, to that one sound that sent a jolt of icy fear through my body. My thoughts were running wild now. Was it a person? Was it something else? But before I could move, before I could make sense of it, the door creaked open on its own. My heart stopped. It was slow at first, as if whatever was on the other side was giving me a moment to prepare, to brace for whatever was about to happen. But nothing came. The door was wide open, and the room beyond was empty. But I knew that it wasn't over. It had just begun. I closed the door quickly, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I locked it shut. The breath, the rasping breath, was gone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was watching me from the shadows. Something that wasn't human, something that wasn't right. I turned to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything, anyone that might reassure me. But outside, the streets remained empty. No signs of life. The plague had taken its toll on the city, leaving it abandoned, stripped of its heartbeat. But now, it wasn't just the sick and the dying that I feared. It was the night itself. I was about to turn away when I noticed something. At the corner of the street, barely visible in the dim light, there was a figure standing. Motionless. It wasn't moving. It wasn't even breathing. But I could feel its gaze. It wasn't looking at the street or the buildings, it was looking right at me, through the window. My skin crawled, my body tensing as I stepped back from the window. Was it real? Was it another survivor? Or was it something else, something that had come with the plague, something that fed off the darkness? The rasping breath echoed again in my mind, and I stumbled backward, shaking my head as if trying to clear it. The cold in the room had become unbearable now, colder than I could stand. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold off the chill, but it wouldn't leave. It was inside me, inside my mind, and there was no escaping it. The scratching sound started again, this time from somewhere deeper in the house. No, it couldn't be. I had locked the door. I had to leave. But the city was no longer the place I knew. It was a graveyard, a maze of shadows and things that shouldn't be. I was trapped here. And something had just found its way in. I could feel my breath shallow, too quick, too frantic. Each inhale was colder, sharper, as if the very air around me was turning against me. The scratching sound from deeper inside the house seemed to echo off the walls, twisting and distorting. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence. Something was there, moving, creeping in the dark corners of the house, where the light couldn't reach. I couldn't stay in this room. I couldn't just wait for whatever that thing was to come for me. My legs felt heavy, like they weren't my own, but I forced them to move. Every step was like walking through thick mud, slow and laborious. The door, once locked so tightly, now felt like a fragile barrier against the unknown. I reached for the handle again, my hand shaking violently, but I couldn't make myself open it. It was too quiet now. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sign of movement outside, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. No sounds of the city. No birds. No cars. Not even the wind. It was as if the world had forgotten how to make noise. As if everything was holding its breath. Suddenly, I felt it. A pressure on the other side of the door, a weight, as though something was pressing against it, pushing just enough to make it feel like the walls were closing in. I pulled away quickly, my pulse racing, my hands slick with sweat. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stay in the room, trapped with nothing but my own panic. I stumbled away from the door, backing into the dark corners of the room. I tried to steady myself, to regain control, but my thoughts were a mess. What was happening? Was this real? Or was it the plague? Maybe it had already begun to affect me, to twist my mind. I remembered the stories, how some people had begun seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that weren't there. But this wasn't in my head. I could feel it. The weight in the air. The suffocating silence that clung to me like a shroud. I needed to leave. I had to get out. But the house, it didn't feel like a safe place anymore. It was as if it were shifting, changing around me, trapping me in a nightmare of its own. The walls seemed to groan and creak, not with the natural sound of a settling building, but with something else, something that was trying to pull me in. I grabbed my coat, my mind working in frantic circles. There had to be a way out. Maybe the back door, or the window. But even as I moved, my feet dragging across the floor, I could feel it. The sensation that I was being watched. The house wasn't empty. I wasn't alone. I opened the window quickly, the cool air rushing in, carrying with it the scent of something foul, something decayed. I pulled myself through the opening, my body stiff with fear, but as soon as I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. The streets, they were wrong. The city around me was no longer the place I had known. It was a twisted version of itself. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows shattered, their doors hanging off their hinges like they'd been abandoned for years. The lights in the street were dimming, flickering like dying stars. And the air was thick with the smell of decay, of death. But it was the silence that struck me the hardest. The entire city was still, as if everything had frozen in place. No sound, no movement. Just an endless, oppressive quiet. I couldn't stay here. I had to find someone, anyone. But there was no one. No sign of life. Only shadows. And then I heard it. A soft, muffled sound. It was coming from the alley across the street, a low scraping noise, like something being dragged across the ground. I hesitated, my heart racing. Was it another survivor? Or something else? I forced myself to move, stepping carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The sound was growing louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one in sight. Just the shadows moving, stretching as if they were alive, following me. I reached the alley, my heart pounding in my ears. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched over, dragging something behind it. It wasn't human. The shape was wrong, its movements jerky, unnatural. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like it was calling to me, drawing me in with its twisted form. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place. The figure turned slowly, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze. It was staring right at me. A deep, guttural sound filled the air, like a growl, low and rumbling. It wasn't a human sound. It was something worse. Then the figure took a step forward, its head tilting to the side, as if studying me, analyzing me. My pulse spiked. What was it? What was happening? Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear clawed at me, urging me to keep moving, to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I could feel it behind me. The sound of dragging, getting closer, growing louder with every step. The city had become a prison. And whatever that thing was, it was hunting me. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost its meaning. My legs were burning, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. The dragging sound, that eerie, hollow scrape, was closer now. Every step, every breath, I could feel it getting nearer. It wasn't just behind me anymore, it was all around me. I turned a corner, my heart hammering in my chest, my body a mess of panic and desperation. I had to keep moving, but I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. The city had become a maze, every street twisting in unnatural ways, every building looming like a giant's shadow. It all looked the same now, decayed, broken, and lifeless. There were no more signs of life. No one to help. And yet, I could feel it. The thing. It was out there, in the corners of my vision, in the rustling of debris on the wind, in the shifting shadows. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, even if I couldn't see them. I stumbled down another alley, my foot catching on something, glass, maybe, or metal. The sharp pain in my ankle made me cry out, but I pushed through it. I couldn't stop. Not now. Not while I was so close to what? Salvation? Escape? I didn't know anymore. I didn't know if anything could save me. The alley opened up into a small courtyard, the buildings surrounding it like silent giants. I slowed my pace, trying to catch my breath, but the sound, it was still there. That dragging sound. It was getting louder. Closer. But I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to. I scanned the courtyard, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. There had to be something here, something that could help, something to hide behind. But everything felt wrong. The shadows were too long, too dark. The air was thick, stifling, like something was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. That's why I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the courtyard. It was just a silhouette, barely visible in the dim light, but I could tell it was tall, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were long and thin, its body hunched in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It was just standing there, unmoving, but I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. Was it the same thing that had been chasing me? Or was it something else? The dragging sound stopped. For a moment, the world went completely silent, as if even the wind had stopped breathing. I stared at the figure, waiting for it to move, to give me a sign of what it wanted. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. I didn't know what to do. My mind was spinning. Should I run? Should I hide? What if it wasn't after me? What if? A sudden, sharp noise shattered the silence. The figure didn't move, but the sound, the scraping, dragging sound, was back. It was closer now, so close that it made the ground vibrate beneath my feet. I looked over my shoulder, fear flooding through my veins. And there it was. The thing. It wasn't the same shape anymore. It was larger now, its limbs stretched out at unnatural angles. It was a grotesque, twisted mass of shadows and flesh, moving with jerky, inhuman motions. It had no face, at least, not one I could see. Just darkness, a gaping void where its eyes should have been. But I could feel it looking at me, feeling its gaze like an icy hand around my throat. I tried to move. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The thing was too close, too fast. I felt its presence behind me, the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating me. The dragging noise was deafening now, like something heavy being dragged across stone. I stumbled forward, my feet barely finding purchase on the cracked pavement. My mind was spinning, and yet all I could hear was the sound of the thing moving closer, closer. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A door. It was hidden behind a pile of debris, barely visible in the shadows, but it was there. I didn't think. I just ran. My fingers fumbled for the handle, my breath coming in desperate gasps. I pushed, pulling it open just wide enough to slip inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was cold, bitterly so, like I had stepped into a freezer. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the silence. There was no dragging sound anymore. No movement. Just an oppressive, crushing quiet. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. I couldn't even hear my own breathing anymore. It was as if everything outside had disappeared. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It was so quiet at first, I thought it might have been the wind, but it grew louder. A voice, no, voices, low, guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere. It was inside my head. The walls around me seemed to press in, closing tighter with each passing second. I looked around, but there was nothing but darkness, cold stone, and shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. I thought I was safe. I thought I had escaped. But in that moment, I knew the truth. The city wasn't just hunting me. It was alive. And whatever that thing was, it had found me. I had to leave. I had to escape again. But I wasn't sure if I could outrun it anymore. The whispering voices grew louder, their words incomprehensible, but the feeling they gave me, that was unmistakable. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Something was trying to reach into my mind, something ancient and malevolent. My body was frozen, but my heart pounded in my chest like a drum. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and cold, sharp like the tip of a knife pressed against my skin. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling the very essence of the city itself. The shadows around me seemed to twist, to move in patterns that didn't belong to the natural world. I could feel them, even though I couldn't see them fully, shifting, stretching, reaching for me, just beyond the corner of my vision. The walls were no longer just walls. They seemed to pulse, to breathe, to groan under some unseen weight. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where could I go? The door had closed behind me with a soft thud, but the feeling that something was watching me was overwhelming. I wasn't alone here. I took a few trembling steps back, my shoes scraping against the stone floor. The darkness pressed in tighter, like a living thing wrapping itself around me. The whispering voices grew sharper, more insistent, as if they were calling me by name, but I couldn't make out the words. The temperature dropped even further, and my breath became visible, rising in clouds in front of my face. I needed to get out. But I didn't know where I was anymore. Everything felt wrong. The layout of the building, the hallway I'd entered through, it was all distorted, like it didn't belong to this world. Each turn led to more corridors that only deepened the feeling of being lost, of being suffocated by the very place itself. I turned a corner and froze. In front of me stood another figure, taller than any human should be, its silhouette dark against the dim light coming from the far end of the hallway. Its limbs were impossibly long, twisting and shifting like they didn't belong to anything that had ever been alive. It stood there, watching, waiting. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, piercing through me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. My feet moved of their own accord, the dread surging through me, urging me to flee. I had no idea what it was. Some part of me wanted to scream, to shout out, but the other part, the part that had been awake since the beginning of this nightmare, told me that doing so would only make it worse. I had to stay silent. The figure took a step forward. Then another. Each step echoed through the hallway like the sound of bones cracking, unnaturally loud in the silence. I turned and ran. The darkness behind me stretched and yawned like a gaping mouth, trying to swallow me whole. I couldn't think about what was behind me. I had to focus on the path ahead. But the hallway seemed to twist and stretch, and every corner I turned felt like it led me deeper into the heart of the city, deeper into its grip. I wasn't just being chased. I was being drawn into something bigger than I could understand. The city itself felt like a living entity, breathing and pulsing around me, guiding my every step. The walls seemed to close in on me as I ran, the shadows thickening, making it harder to see. My hands brushed against the rough stone as I tried to steady myself, but the further I went, the more I felt the presence behind me. It wasn't just one thing. It was everywhere. I could feel it creeping up my spine, crawling under my skin, getting into my mind. Then, as I rounded another corner, I saw it. A door. This one was different. The light beyond it wasn't like anything I had seen before. It was a soft, pulsing glow, almost like a heartbeat. It felt like a way out, but also like a trap. But what choice did I have? The thing behind me was getting closer, and I didn't have the luxury of second guesses. I lunged for the door, my fingers trembling as they grasped the cold handle. I threw it open, and the light flooded in, bathing the hallway in an eerie glow. I stepped into the room, heart racing, but the moment I crossed the threshold, everything stopped. The air in here was different. It wasn't cold, but it was still thick with that oppressive, suffocating weight. I couldn't hear the voices anymore. I couldn't feel the shadows. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. I turned to face the room. It was small, cramped, with walls lined with strange symbols and carvings. The light came from a single source in the center, a small, glowing orb suspended in midair, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe, like they were alive, twisting in response to my presence. I stepped closer to the orb, drawn to it, but something stopped me. A sudden, sharp pain pierced my skull, like a knife driven into my mind. I gasped, stumbling back, clutching my head as the pain intensified. The room began to spin, and I felt myself falling to my knees. Then, through the haze of pain, I heard it. A voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the agony. You are not alone. I didn't recognize the voice, but I could feel its presence in my bones, deep within my chest. It wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by the weight of its words. The city is awake, and so are you. And then, I realized with chilling clarity, it wasn't just the city that was alive. It was me, too. The thing that had been chasing me, it had been part of me all along. The pain in my skull subsided, but the presence, the voice, it lingered, crawling beneath my skin. I felt its weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me with every breath. The room around me remained eerily still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. Watching. The orb in the center of the room flickered, and the symbols on the walls twisted in a slow, agonizing dance. Each movement of the symbols was like a pulse, a heartbeat syncing with my own. I had no control over my body. I was merely a spectator in my own skin, trapped inside a mind that was unraveling piece by piece. The city is awake, and so are you. The words echoed through my thoughts, resonating in a place that felt too deep, too ancient. I could almost hear the buildings themselves, groaning in the distance, shifting as if they were alive, as if they were breathing. The very earth under my feet trembled, a low, almost imperceptible vibration. It was like the ground itself had become a part of this growing nightmare, alive and aware. I reached out a trembling hand toward the glowing orb. Its light seemed to pull at me, promising answers I didn't want to know, drawing me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. As my fingers brushed the surface of the orb, a surge of energy shot through my body, raw and electric, sending a shockwave of terror crashing through my veins. A vision flashed before my eyes. The city, no, the entire world, was engulfed in darkness. People were running, screaming, their faces twisted in agony, but no matter how fast they ran, they were always just one step behind something they couldn't see. Something that stalked them in the shadows, in the spaces between their breaths. The very ground beneath them cracked, splitting open to swallow them whole. And then, through the chaos, I saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, with limbs that stretched beyond what should have been possible. Its face was a grotesque mockery of humanity, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. It reached out, its fingers elongating, touching the world, touching me, and in that moment, I understood. It's not just the city. It's everything. I gasped, pulling my hand away from the orb as if burned. The vision shattered, and the room snapped back into focus. But the air around me was thick now, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. It felt as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear, and I was at the center of it. The walls began to pulse with an eerie rhythm, the symbols writhing like worms, trying to break free. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, but it was gone. The hallway had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall of shadows, stretching up to an endless, dark void. There was no way out. No way to run. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a presence, a force that surrounded me, filled me, consumed me. You are the last. The city belongs to you now. I fell to my knees, the weight of the words pressing down on me like a mountain. The shadows around me began to take shape, coalescing into figures I had seen before, in fleeting glimpses, in the corners of my vision. People. But they weren't human anymore. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. They reached for me, their hands cold and skeletal, their mouths opening in silent screams. I wanted to scream too, but my voice caught in my throat. The air had grown so thick, I could barely breathe. I could feel their fingers brushing against my skin, their touch like ice, their presence suffocating. The city had never been alive like this. I had been wrong. It wasn't just the buildings that were awake. The people, the lives that once filled the streets, they were part of it too. This plague, this curse, it had changed everything. Changed them. And now, it was changing me. The figures circled around me, their eyes locked onto mine. They knew me. They knew what I had done to survive. I had walked among them, ignored the whispers, turned away from the signs. And now, I was no different from them. I tried to stand, but my legs refused to obey. My mind was slipping, unraveling, but something primal within me was still fighting. I couldn't let go. Not yet. I crawled toward the orb again, my hands scraping against the cold stone, my breath ragged as the shadows closed in around me. I didn't know if it was hope or madness that drove me, but I reached for it once more. As my fingers made contact, I was thrown back, my body convulsing, my mind filled with images, visions of the city, of the world, of the horrors that lay beyond. It was all connected, all part of the same nightmare. I understood now. The plague wasn't a disease. It was the end. The reckoning. The beginning of something else. Something that was coming. And I was the last to know. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.